What's up guys, welcome back to the channel and welcome to this video. In this video, we're going to learn how to build an e-commerce site from scratch. I'm going to show you how to set up authentication, authorization, how to add products, remove products, and so much more using Fauna and Snipcart. Now this video is sponsored by Fauna and I want to thank them again for sponsoring this video. Before we get started, please make sure you're subscribed to the channel. Please make sure you comment on more things you want to see in the Jamstack. Now let's get into it.
Let's start with Snipcart. Snipcart is a quick and easy way to add a shopping cart to any website and allows you to start accepting payments immediately once you've tested your integration. So the way that this works is we're going to log into our dashboard. When you log in, you get all the goodies of an e-commerce platform. So you get your orders down here, when the last completed one was, etc., etc. So what we're going to do is in the top right hand corner, we're going to click this button here. And then we're going to start looking at things that we need. So the first thing we're going to need is this API keys section under account. We're going to select that, and then we're going to take this public API key along with this piece of code here, and we're going to implement that into our Next.js website. What this is going to allow us to do is basically integrate Snipcart, and that's all we really need. Then what we're going to do is we're going to use something from Colby Fayak, who you may or may not know in the Jamstack world, has created a cool little package that allows us to essentially use a hook to hook in and get the Snipcart details. So we're going to use both of those things to integrate Snipcart. So make sure you copy this public key down and also just copy these as we'll be using them throughout. So we're back in our code here and we need to add a new page here called underscore document.js. Now the underscore document.js is similar to this underscore app.js in which we can override things as needed. And we can use this document.js to essentially do things like CDNs, style sheets, configurations, any scripts we might need to run, things like that. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to actually copy and paste in some next document stuff. And this stuff is found in the Next.js documentation, but essentially what we have here is the document, which is the Next.js version of this file that we're going to override, then HTML and head, main, and next script. So these three should be familiar. They're just standard HTML, and then this next script is just a way to import next script, which allows you to run next. So now we've got that all covered. We're going to do a class here called myDocument, and it's going to extend document. So it's going to pull in this document here and extend it. Then we're going to say static async get initial props, and we're going to use context here, and we're going to say const initial props is equal to await document dot get initial props from the context, and then return those. So essentially what we're saying here is, hey, get all the initial props from our context here when we're loading up, and then provide those back to this document. And that's just to ensure that when we're overriding that we're not missing out on any features. So now we have this, we can close this out and add another one here. And then just to make sure, we should do export default my document so that we're exporting this out so that it's available when we launch our application. Now we have this inside of our render method is where we're going to do our return functionality. Now return functionality is essentially going to take all the pieces that we've imported up here and put them into our document so that it works as a normal Next.js application. So with any web app, you need HTML first. So we can just put in HTML. Then we need head. And we need that to be uppercase head. Then outside of that, we need our body. So then our body becomes available. And then we're going to put in a self-closing tag for main and one for next script. So that imports all of our main and next script, which are all the scripts ready for Next.js. Then we're going to need a script here, and that script is going to do something for Snipcart. And we're also going to need a div here, and this div is also going to do something for Snipcart. So now we have all that. What we're going to do is inside of our head here, we're going to import all of the style sheets that we need and the CDNs for Snipcart, which were available when you pulled out that fresh API. So we just copy and paste those in, and here they are. And then we need to do something inside of this script. Now, what this script is going to do is actually load the JS that's available for this theme. So we can just do an asynchronous source and put in, instead of /snipcart.css, we can do /.js. So we can put that inside of this script here. So it's async source, and it's exactly the same /js. And then inside of this div is where we're actually going to allow Snipcart to do something. So it needs a div, and we're going to hide this using the hidden tag, and we're going to give it an ID of Snipcart. So that knows, okay, this is where our Snipcart data is going to live. Then we need 3 props: data, API key, data config, modal style, and data templates URL. Now this API key is the public API key that we pulled down, and let me just rename this to .local. So inside of this .local file here, the .m.local, we have this next public Snipcart API key, so we can use that inside of here. So process.env next public Snipcart API key, and that's because in production, technically you have to use the production keys for Stripe and for Snipcart. So this makes it easier for us to just handle that. Instead of hard coding it in here, we can just say, hey, use what's ever available. When you deploy to Vercel, you can choose whether or not to use one for production or maybe a staging environment, and that handles it nicely. Then we're going to tell it the modal style. So we're going to use side here, and this is going to give us a little sidebar. And then finally, the template URLs I find at Snipcart templates.html. And hit save. And now we have this fully working thing. So let's go ahead and test this and make sure it works. And then we can come back and talk about what we're going to do next. Okay, so our website doesn't really look any different. And that's because we don't have a button up here to access the sidebar. And we don't really have any products for Snipcart to use. So what you can do here is type / pound key or whatever you want to call that, and then /checkout and hit enter, and then it will bring out the checkout for you. And this obviously is holding some storage from when I showed you the built product, but that's how that works. So we can see that Snipcart is working locally, but now we kind of need to work on Fauna to be able to provide data to Snipcart. So let's talk about how we're going to create this schema. Okay, so we're back in our application. I'm going to create a folder here called scripts. And this is just so you can find it if you want to check out the code. But this is not required. But this is where we're going to store the schema file. So if you've never used the GraphQL before with Fauna, it is required to have a file that is a schema file that defines all the types, all the functions, all the mutations, all the queries, all of that stuff in one place that you then upload to Fauna, and Fauna can then handle it through GraphQL. So to do that, we can do schema dot and then GQL and hit enter. Now we have this GraphQL file, we can do whatever we want with it. So we're going to have a type here called product, and that's going to handle our products. We're also going to have a type of user. We're also going to have an enum here of user role. And we're also going to have things called inputs. And these inputs essentially state what could be submitted in a form, in a mutation, so that it knows what to expect and to give you errors if you send the wrong things down. So we're going to have an input here called create user input. And that's if you're trying to register your account. We're also going to have a login version. So that's input login user input, and then also one for the product. So that's going to be product input. Then we're going to state the queries that we're going to have. So that's type query. And then we're going to have some queries in here. And then finally, one more type, mutations. And those are things that we may need to manipulate a database, such as adding, deleting, updating, etc. So let's talk about type product. So Snipcart requires some very specific things to use correctly with Snipcart. It needs things like a URL or an image, name, a price, an ID, etc., etc. So what we can do here is minimize this and look actually at Snipcart and define our product schema based upon that. So you can see here that we have this button and it has this data item ID, data price, URL, description, item, and name. So we can define our products based upon that. So if we go back to our code, we just minimize this screen and look at the product, we're going to need a name, and that's going to be a string. We're going to need a URL. That's going to be a string. We're going to need an image of some type. That can also be a string. A description will also be a string. And then price, we'll have it as a string, and then an ID, also a string. And these are all required fields. So that's what the exclamation point means. It means they must be there for you to be able to insert a product. It has to have all of these things. Okay, so that one's kind of easy. Then we have a user. So if you think about a user and the things that we have here, we're going to need two things to really make a user work. We're going to need the email address and the role. We're also going to need the password, but we're actually going to do something special when we create a user that essentially obscures that from the database and it's not accessible. So we only need to put in the things that are accessible in this type. So we can have email, and then we'll just say string, and we'll do this at unique. And that means that only you can sign up with a email one time, so you can't have multiple of the same. Then we need a role, and we'll set this to user role. And then what that's essentially doing is referencing this enum here. So we're going to have an enum. One's going to be a manager and one's going to be an employee. So that's that. Then we're going to create these inputs. And how this works is essentially you just tell it what we're expecting. So when we're creating a user, which means someone's registering, we're expecting a string for an email. We're also expecting a password to be a string, and then the role, and we're expecting that to be user role. And those are all required to sign up. Then we have the login user input here, and the only things we should be expecting then is an email and a password. And then we're down to product input, and you kind of get the idea. We're actually just going to copy and paste this. This is what I'm expecting to show up. So we can copy and paste this. Now we can look at queries. Now what we're going to do here is we're going to have two different queries that we're going to run. One is all products, and then one is all products by ID. So we can do all products, and we can tell it we're expecting product. So all products is going to return a type of product. Then we're going to need one for all products by ID. So we can just say get products by ID. And we're going to pass in and tell it we're going to need an ID to do this. And that will be a string. And that is also a type of product. And then finally, we have mutations. These are things, insert, update, delete, those kinds of things. So we're going to need one for create user. We're going to need one for login user. We're going to need one for adding a product and one for deleting a product. So those are going to be our mutations. How do they work? So we're going to tell it we need data, and that data is going to be create user input. So we're going to tell it, hey, we're going to need this. Now this just makes it really easy. So instead of having to type out, I need this, this, and this, we can just reference it here and put it down here, making it really clean to understand if you were to give this schema to somebody else. Then we're going to tell it it's a type of user. And then we're going to do this thing called a resolver. Now, what a resolver does is essentially says, I am going to create a custom resolver for this mutation that you can expect a specific name, and that's going to create a function inside of Fauna. And Fauna is going to say, okay, here's the function, and this is what should happen when you are trying to create a user. So we can do resolver here and do name, and then give it a name. So we'll just create user, and then at that point, this one is done. Now, the login user is basically the same thing, except from we can copy this down, and we'll actually take it from here and say paste. What we're going to do is change this to login user input. And I'm actually going to change the type from returning a user to returning a string, because what I'm going to return here is just a security key that we can use to make calls. And then at resolver name login user. Then we need to add the product, right? So if we need to add a product, we're going to take an ID of string, and then we're also just going to take data as product input. Now this ID as string will make sense. What I want to be able to do is stop people from adding the same product twice. Then we need to return product as a type. And then we need to give it a resolver. Same as before, give it a name, and we'll call this one add product. And then for delete product, it's exactly the same idea here. We're going to take this, copy it down from here, paste it in. But what we're going to change is what's expected here. We're not going to take in a full input. We're going to take just this ID as a string, and we're going to call it delete product and hit save. So our schema is done now. So we can go into Fauna, login, and start looking at how these functions are going to be created, how they're going to work, and what we need to do to update them. So here we are in Fauna, and I've created this new database called products-demo. Select that, and it's going to ask you to create a new collection, but we don't have to do any of that. We can just click GraphQL, import schema, find the script where we created it, double click, and it'll import the schema for us. So what did it actually do? Now we have this playground that we can play around with. Well, it created all of our functions here: add product, create user, delete product, login user. And what you'll notice is it just says function add product was not implemented yet. Please access your database and provide the implementation. Because we created these functions without providing anything, we can actually send updates to this database, which I'm going to show you how to do in the shell, to add the functionality that we want it to do. It also created the indexes here: unique user email, get products by ID, all products. And then we have our collection here, product and user, that we can play around with. So now what do we do? So we have all this functionality, but we can't really do a lot. Like, sure, we could query some data or insert some data, but these functions need to be added for us to be able to use it properly. So let's talk about how that works. So let's talk about creating users first. Let's just use those as a good start point here. So create user, we know, is going to need to take in some data. We're expecting a password, an email, and the role, and then insert those into the database. We then want to return the data in a specific way so that users can't see passwords if they happen to be in the database, or for example, the database got compromised. We want someone to just click user and see, oh, here's the user's password, got it. Like, we don't want that to happen. So what we can do is use this thing called the shell. Now the shell I have covered in previous videos, but it essentially allows you to manipulate things in the database, whether that's to actually call a function, whether that's to update a function, add a new function, delete a function, or just generally do queries. So we're going to do an update function. So update function with a capital F. They are two different things. So you want to make sure you're using the capital function here and say create underscore user, because that's the name of the function we gave it, create user. So we want to make sure that that's the function we're updating. Then we could say comma. And then on the next line, we can open some parentheses here and say body. And that's the body of the function. Query. So we're going to make a query here. And then inside of that, we'll do lambda. And inside of that lambda, we're going to send in an array. So you can do open squares and say data. And then on the other side of that, we're going to, inside of this part, we're going to do create. And then inside of that, we're going to do collection. And we're going to do user. So this is going to create something inside the collection user, which is here. So essentially what we're telling it is, inside this lambda, do a create in this collection. And then inside of that collection is where we can do credentials. And then inside of here, we can set this to password. And this is essentially telling it that this is part of our credentials. So password, select password. And that's going to come from the variable data. So what this is saying is, hey, go ahead and look inside of this data and look for the name password. And that's going to be our password. And then that will allow us to keep that secure. So it won't show up in the database. So we can then do this and then close this out and hit comma. Then we can tell it the data. So the data is what's going to be inserted into the database. So we say data, email, select, email, comma, and then the var will be from data. And then we can copy this down, drop down another and say role. And say select role. And that's going to come from the same place. So now we have this. If we run this query, it will then put something in the shell. But first, let me clear this up so that we can actually look at it in a better way so that we can see how it actually looks instead of being all jumbled up. Okay, so we have a nice clear version here. And we can say update function body query lambda, and we're going to pass in the variable data. We're going to create on the collection user, so create a new row on this collection. These are our credentials. Don't insert those. This is our data, email and role. When you run this query, you're going to get something in the shell and the function will be updated. So you can see here, this was a bunch of stuff was spat out and it said time elapsed 176 milliseconds. If we now go and look at the function and click create user, you can now see that this has been inserted into this function. This function is now available to be used if we so wish. So now we need to do one for the login, and then we need to do one for add product and delete product so that all of our functions will work. So let's move on to the login version, login_user for a function. The good news is we can almost reuse a lot of this code to create our login user. What we're looking for is a way to essentially say, hey, take the input, there's a secret, and we're going to use that for our password, and please let us know if they can successfully log in. And this is all part of the cool features of Fauna offering in authorization and authentication. So we've got this create user that's now in here. And now we can create the login user part too. So from the shell, we can clear out this and we can write a new update function. We can clear our shell. And this update function is going to start very similar. Update function. And then inside of here, we can do login_user because that's the one we want to use. Then we can tell it exactly what we want to do. So update, comma, and then we're going to do our parentheses here and make sure we close out the other side of the update function. And inside of here, we're going to say body, and then query. And then inside our query, we're going to do a lambda. And that lambda function is going to take an array, which is an input. And that's going to contain all of the things coming from that login input that we set in our schema originally. We're going to say, please do a select statement. So inside of this lambda, we need to do a select statement. So we can do comma here. And just to easier, I'll put it on the next line. We can say select. So we're going to do a select query. Secret. So select our secret. Login match. So we're going to tell it to login and match the index. And the index here in this query is going to be this unique user email. So we can just say, back in our shell here, index, then open another set of parentheses and say user, oh, sorry, make sure we get it right, unique user email. We'll just copy that. Unique user email. And then comma, select email. So select the email, comma, var input. So we're saying in this, we want to query and select the secret, log in by matching the index unique user email. So match this index by using the email that was put in the input. So now we have that part. We can say all the way out to here. We can then do a comma and then another set of parentheses. And inside of these parentheses, we're going to say password, select, password, and that's also going to come from comma var input. And that's it. So this is done now. So let's clean this up a little bit and make it look a bit neater so you can actually see what's happening. And then we can talk about how it works again. Okay, so here is the function that's been cleaned up a little bit. So we're going to query the lambda from the input. So this input is going to be what the user passes down from a form. We're going to select the secret, which matches the login for this unique user email. So whatever the email is that they're passing in, and the password. So we run this query and we get this time elapsed. If we look at the function now and go to login user, it's now done. So now we have the functions to create a user and to log a user in. So let's just try that in GraphQL. Okay, so let's start by creating a user and making sure the create user function works. So we can do mutation here. So mutation, register user. And then inside of here, we can do create user. We're going to give it some data. And remember, the data is what we told it we would send down in the input. So we can do email. We'll put a space here and say jamesperkins@hey.com. And we'll say password. And then if you're unsure of what is required, you can just hit Control and space, and it will give you what we need. So password, say password 1, and then we need a role. And for the role, if you hit Control space again, it'll actually give you the roles that we want. So I want to be a manager, and then we need to return something here. And again, Control space, and I'll take an email. And if you run this query, you'll get this, which is the returned email. And in our collections under user, we now have a user. And as you can see, there is no password because we don't need it. So now we have this, we can actually just keep this and click a new tab here and keep this registered user because we can use it in our code and just swap out the variables as needed. So let's try and log in with the user that I just created. So we're going to do another mutation here. So mutation, and then we're going to do a login user, and that login user is also going to take some data, and that data in this scenario will be email. So that should be jamesperkins@hey.com, and then the password, the super secure password 1. And what should be returned is a secret, but we don't actually need to state that we want anything returned. It's not required, so we just give this mutation a name real quick. We'll call it user login, and then we hit run, and now we get this secret, and now this secret can be used for our database if we had any roles, which we haven't set up yet. So now we have the ability to log in, we have the ability to create a user, so those two things are done. We also just need to do 2 more functions here. In our functions, we still need to add product and delete product. Once we have those 2 functions, we can start talking about how you can use roles to denote what people can and can't do. So let's talk about the add product function here. So add products are essentially a way to add in a new product to our collection. What's important about this is when you add a product, you want to be able to check whether or not this has already been added as a product, because we don't want someone to add the same product over and over again, at least the same ID, because that will cause problems in our application. And also we just don't want someone to add 100 different versions of pizza. So what we can do is use something called if, and an if statement allows you to basically say if something exists, do something, otherwise do something else, just like you would in JavaScript with an if-else statement. We're going to do that with our add product. So what we need to think about is how this is going to work. So with add product, in the schema file, we denoted 2 things. We created a add product, and it wants to take in at minimum a ID, which was a string, and then the data from the product input. So we need to make sure that we're sending in those 2 pieces. So let's create that in our shell. So let's clear out the shell and start talking about how this is going to work. So what we need to do again is do the same thing that we've done previously. Use the update functionality. So we do update and then function, and the function name, which is add_product. Then we need to actually do the body work. So inside of here, we can do body and then query, just as we did before, and then lambda. And then inside of the lambda, first we need to send out what we're going to be sending down to the lambda function. So the first thing we need to do is name product_ID. That will be the product ID to verify whether or not we've done this before. And we can also send the product object. So we can do product object. And this is going to be used to check if it exists. And then this will be what we insert into our database. So now we have that. We can look here and see that we need to do let. And we need the let query. And we're going to say inside a set of parentheses, product. And that's going to be the name of ours. And we're going to say match index. And if you look at our indexes, we have this get products by ID. So we're going to use that. So we can go back to our shell here and say index, and then make sure we get the right name. Just copy and paste it right from here and say get products by ID. And then we need our variable, which is going to be the product ID. So we can say underneath our index here, we can say var and then product ID. And that will take this product ID and see if this exists. Now we have this essentially a variable here called product that we can use somewhere else. So now that we have that, we can say if, so if as in the keyword if, if exists, and then we can say var, and then product, and that's this here. We can say if this exists, we can underneath say abort. And what abort does is essentially just stop the query from running. So at this point, we can handle it however we want. So we can say product already exists. Please check product ID. So now we have that. Underneath this here, we can say let. So another let inside of our let. And say, okay, if that didn't exist for whatever reason, so this is going to execute if it exists. If it doesn't exist, inside of here, we can say, let's create a new product. So we can say new product, create collection. So create on the collection of product. And we'll take in data. And the data will be from var product object. And then underneath this section here, we can then return var and say new product. So essentially we're saying, hey, return whatever comes back from this. And that's the whole function. So let's clean this up really quick and then we'll make it big enough so we can read it all. Okay, so here's the function again. Let's talk about this one. So we got add product here. We're taking in a query and the Lambda is taking in two variables, a product ID and then a product object. So this is going to be an object of product and this is just the ID as a string. We're then saying, go ahead and run this query and we're going to call it product. The result of this is product. It says if it exists, so if this exists, abort and say product ID exists, then we're going to say otherwise, insert a new collection, insert a new row in the collection product with the data from product object, and then return back new product. So if we run this now, it will add it to our functions. And there we go, 201 milliseconds. If we look at our function now, we now have the add product. So let's go ahead and test the add product, and then we can add the delete product, and then we can go back to our application after we've made some roles and start actually using all of this data that we've used in Fauna to power Snipcart. So we have a new tab in our GraphQL playground, and we're keeping all of these because we want to be able to use them later on in our application, and it just saves time versus having to rewrite these queries later on. So this one is going to be a mutation, and this mutation is going to be called, what should we call this one? Add product. And inside of this mutation, we're going to say add product, and then we're going to take in the ID and the product data. So we can give it an ID. So we can say ID, and we'll just set this to pizza, and we can hear a data underneath that. So data, and this is going to be an object versus just a string. And then we need the name. So we can give it a name and call it pizza. We can then give it a URL. And for now, that will be products. Actually, we'll just call it pizza. We'll name it the same as the ID that we're going to give it. So image, we can just say for now, images/pizza. We'll give it a description and we'll say the best pizza in town, really good cheese. And then we need a price. Well, $20. And then finally an ID, and we're going to match this to the URL. So we'll just say pizza, and that should be enough to insert into our database. And then we just need to return something after the fact so that we know that it is good. So we can do a close this and then open another set of parentheses and say, please return, let's say, the name. We run the query and you can see that name pizza is available. And then if we go to our collections, you can now see that this is in our database. So we're super close to being done. We just need to do one more function and one more part about roles and how the roles kind of play in to this project. So we're back in our functions, and the final one that we need to make is this delete product. It isn't ready to go, but what's good about the way that we write functions here is that we can actually take essentially what we wrote for our original add product and modify it slightly to make it work for delete. So I'm going to take this query here and go back to the shell, and we're going to place that in this body here and say, I want to update the delete product, and I don't need this project object this time because we only need this ID to make this work. Then we're going to use the same one here, this same Lambda function here, to look and see if this product is available. And then we're going to say if it exists, then we want to do our delete function. Otherwise, we want to abort. So we can basically remove this let here and say, no, thank you. And then put something in here that says delete, select, and then we want the ref. And the ref is the reference ID, which associates itself with the item that we are looking for. And we can say get var product. And that should be enough for us to be able to do what we want. So let's just make sure that we do this correctly. Okay, there we go. So what we're saying here is if it exists, so using the same function here, which is using get products by ID, which is our index here, we're saying do that. And then if it exists, instead of aborting like we did last time, we'll go ahead and delete it out. Otherwise, let's say the product does not exist. And that's it. That should be our last Lambda function. I'm just going to neaten this up and we can talk about it one more time. So yeah, here we go with this Lambda function. So we're doing the exact same thing that we did last time. We're going to update the delete product this time. We're going to take in just the product ID versus before we were taking in both the product and the product object. We're going to run the same query using our index. And then if it does exist and we get a variable back from this product, use the reference from here and then go ahead and delete it. Otherwise, just tell us that it doesn't exist. So if we run this query, we should be good to go. And there we go. Time elapsed 181 milliseconds. We look at our function now, and it has the delete function. So if we go to our GraphQL here and make a new tab and say mutation, delete, product. And inside of here, we find our delete product function. And we put in our ID, which was pizza. Then all we need to do is take that and get what we want returned. So we can just do this. And then in our return here, we can just say, we'll take a name. And then if we run this, it should be deleted and pizza was returned. And if I run it again, we get product does not exist. So we now know that if there is no product, we can't delete it. But if we do delete it, it should return the name and we're good to go. So that's all of these cool functions that we've built that is going to save us time on the other side. We've also got all of our GraphQL queries that we really need from a product and a registration standpoint. We've also fixed all the functions, make sure all our indexes have worked, looked at our collections, added a user. So let's talk about creating a custom role for our managers and for our employees. So the first thing we need to do is come over to this role section, which is under security and then roles. And then we're going to click new custom role. We're going to give this one a name of manager. And then we're going to tell Fauna what we can and cannot do with this manager role. So first, let's add the product collection. We want them to be able to read, want them to be able to create and delete, but we don't want them to write. We don't want them to update any products. Although you could extend this tutorial and add ability to update products, and you could do that by selecting this role. Then we need the indexes. We need them to be able to get products by ID, and we need them to be able to read that too. And then we need to add the function. So we need them to be able to call add product and call delete product. Then we need to come over to this membership section here, and we need to use this to essentially tell Fauna how to decide what role that we're using. So the way that this works is we're going to write a quick query here that tells Fauna how to decide if or not they are the correct kind of role. So to do that, we're going to click this add membership and we're going to select user. Then inside of this user, we're going to delete everything inside, and then we're going to type lambda. And then we're going to do user ref. And then we can delete this out now because we have something. There we go. And then we're going to say comma equals select data, comma, role. So essentially we're asking for the role. Then we can say get var user ref. So user ref. So essentially this user ref. And then comma. And then the role that we want. So in this example, we want manager. This will tell us whether or not they are a manager. Let's just close this all out and then hit save. And now we have this custom role. And then we can do another custom role. We'll call this one employee. And then we'll add the collection of product and we'll say they can read only. And then the membership is going to be the exact same thing. So in the user section. And what we'll do is I'll copy and paste this in. It's the same Lambda expression. And then what we'll do is we'll change from manager to employee. And then hit save. And now we have a manager and an employee. So what we can do now is actually test that functionality. So the question is, how do we actually test this to make sure that our roles are doing what we expected? So first we need to log in. So in your user login mutation, we're going to log in with our manager role. We're going to take this key here, copy it. And then we're going to go to add product. So we have an add product and I filled in here. And we're going to go down here under HTTP headers, type the word bearer, hit a space, and then drop in the key. Then what we should be able to do is hit this button and this should go through no problem. And it looks like it went through. Let's check our collection and here it is. So that went and that's fine. So we know that now our user for managers seems to work correctly. Now if we log in and we look at our collections, look at our users and say James Perkins 1 is only an employee. So let's copy that. Go to our GraphQL and log in. Same password. We get a new user log in. Copy that. Go to add product. And we'll go ahead and drop in our bearer token. And we'll change this to pasta. And then another pasta here. And hit play. And we get permission denied. So our employees can't actually add products, but our managers can. So now we've basically done everything inside of Fauna to set it up ready for use in the application. So now what we're going to do is we're going to build out this UI and use all of these mutations and user logins and everything like that. Now, if you've been following along and you missed the description on screen, all of these functions that I've created, so all of these update functions that we wrote, are going to be in a file in the GitHub repository, allowing you to just copy and paste them in and you should be good to go. The only thing you will have to do is this quick roles and security section, which is just a few clicks, and then you can be in the same position if you don't want to go through all the steps. So let's move on. Let's start actually using this in our application. So welcome back to our application. And as you can see, we just don't have anything. So what we're going to do is start creating all of the functionality for the homepage. So the homepage is just going to display a grid of items that we can then have users buy. First thing we need to do is actually install another package. And that package is the GraphQL packages we're going to need, and also the Snipcart package we're going to need. So let's do those now. So let's install all of those. So we do yarn add @apollo/client. We can install cookie. We can install GraphQL and use Snipcart. And once all of those have installed, I'll meet you back here and we can talk about how we're going to implement. So now that's installed, your package JSON should look something like this: Apollo client, chakra stuff, cookie, GraphQL, use Snipcart. So now we have all of this. Let's start building our pages. So the first thing we need to do is update our app.js. Our app.js needs some updating so that we can hook into Snipcart and we can use the Apollo client. So from here, we're going to wrap our application in the Apollo client. So we can do Apollo provider client equals client. And then we're going to wrap all of our application in it like so. And then we need to wrap also it in a Snipcart provider. So the way that that works is inside of here, we can do Snipcart provider, and then on the other side of that we can close it out, and this all needs to be imported at the top. So we can do import Snipcart provider, and that comes from use Snipcart, and let's just update this because it's the incorrect usage. And then once we have this installed, we also need to do Apollo provider. So we can do import Apollo provider. And that comes from Apollo/client. So now we have Apollo and we have this Snipcart, but we don't have this thing called client. So we're going to build that next. But what we can do is we can preface it and say we're going to import client, and that's going to come from /lib/Apollo client. And we can hit save, and then we can create this file next. So create a folder, call it lib. Inside that lib folder, we're going to create Apollo/client.js, and inside of here is where we're going to create our client code. The way that this works is we just tell Apollo how we want to launch and how we're going to use it. So what's the GraphQL endpoints, what kind of bearer tokens do we need, etc., etc. So we can do import here, Apollo client, and that's going to come from, and also in-memory cache, and that's coming from Apollo client. So from Apollo/client. Then we need to create it. So export const client equals new Apollo client. And then inside of here, we're going to do URI headers and then cache. So the URI that we're going to use is one from FaunaDB, and it's https graphql.fauna.com/GraphQL. And that's the same for everybody. It doesn't change based upon where you are. So that's what you need. So make sure you've got that in. Then the headers, we need authorization. And then the authorization is going to be bearer space. And then we're going to process .m.fauna db underscore secret key. So the fauna db secret key, and then a comma here and a comma here. And then we just need to do our cache. So the way that cache works here is we're not going to do any caching, in fact. So we're going to do in-memory cache, comma, default options, and then query. So when we're doing queries, the fetch policy here is going to be no cache. And you might think that's a bit strange, but when you're using incremental static generation, we don't want them to cache something and we update it and then our app doesn't do anything with it. So hit save here and let's go and get a FaunaDB secret key. So I'm back in FaunaDB and you can see that we have create your first key. So click new key, we want server. And then if you want to give it a name and then hit save. The key will appear on the screen and go ahead and put that in as a option in your .env.local file. Okay, so we've now set up our Snipcart provider, we've set up our Apollo provider, and we've set up this client so that we're ready to consume anything that we might need inside of here. At this point, we're actually ready to create something on this homepage. So let's start there. So let's begin by creating our homepage. The homepage is going to essentially allow us to show all of the products all in one spot. Now, once someone has decided on a product, we'll also be able to click them and go into that page directly. So here we have the home screen or the home, which is under index.js. And I've just removed all the code and added export async function getStaticProps. Now, if you remember, we created this Apollo client here, which allows us to essentially make calls to Fauna. And we also, in our app.js, also have this Snipcart provider, which allows you to basically hook in and see if anyone's added anything to the cart. So we're going to be implementing all of that on this page. But first, let's start by adding getStaticProps and everything else that we might need to make this work correctly. So first, we're going to import a bunch of stuff. So we need to import client from Apollo client. So that's where we just created it. So it's under lib/apollo/client. We're also going to need GraphQL. So we can do import GraphQL, so GQL from @apollo/client. And we're also going to need to use a few things from Chakra UI. Now, if you're not using Chakra UI when you're following this, that's fine, but we're going to need a button, a way to do a grid, so that's simple grid, a way to do a heading, box, vertically stack something, some sort of text, and center it. And that's all coming from @Chakra UI/React. And then one thing that we will need from next, at least, is import link from next link. And then we want to use that hook, the use Snipcart hook. So we can import that from use Snipcart, and that's coming from use Snipcart. So that's everything imported now that we need for this page, and some of it we're going to use directly now, and other pieces we may not use until afterwards. So let's talk about getStaticProps. So the getStaticProps, we are going to essentially say we want all of the products, and then we want all the data associated with it. Now, if you look at the schema, we have this query called all products that just returns the product. And the product is name, URL, image, description, price, and ID. So we can put that in here. So we can do const data equals await client dot query. And then inside of here, we can say query. And this is using this client. So it's going to import from local. And we're going to say GQL for GraphQL so that it knows that's what we're using. And then we can make our query. So we can do query get all products. And then all products, because that's the actual query name. So this is the named query that we're calling it. This is the query that we created. And then we just tell it data and then everything that we need. So name, description, URL, image, price, and ID. And then that will return to us all products and the data. So what we can do now is say const all products. So we can destructure it from the data. So we can return that. So return. And then inside of our return, we can do props, all products, and then a comma. And then we can say, please revalidate this. I'm going to set it to 10 seconds for this example. But you might want to increase this if you aren't adding products very often. So now we have this getStaticProps. What we can do is take this all products and drop it in here and say, I want to use this all products to essentially fill out some information. So what we can do is say const data equals all products. And that will break this. So this will be this section here now. So we'll be able to use this directly versus having to put all products.data.name, all products.data description, etc., etc. So in our return, we can add a box here. And then we can say, we'll have a main. And inside the main, we'll have a heading. We'll do heading as h1. And say text align equals center. So in the middle, and we'll just say welcome to our store. Then we can do a simple grid. Now simple grids allow you to essentially state how you want the grid to be handled based upon the size of the screen. So I'm going to set this to 1 and 2. So on a small screen, it will show 1 at a time. Anything bigger, it will show 2. Then we can start mapping over this data to produce each of our buttons with our products. So we can do data.map and then product. And then we can make this into a returnable function. So we're going to return and use the return here to say we want to vertically stack. So vstack will vertically stack our products. We'll take the key, which will be, let's change this to product because it's going to be each one of the products. We change the key equal to product.id. And then we'll just add some margins at the top to push them away from each other. And then we'll also do MX auto, so it's centered. And then inside of that, we can close it. And now we have this vertical stack where we can essentially do whatever we want. So in the beginning, let's just do a heading as say H4, something small. Size is large. And we'll text align in the center. And we'll give that the product name. So we can just do product.name. And then we need an image. So we can use next image and say image is equal to source equals product.image. We'll set the alt text to product.name. And then we'll set a width equal to 600 pixels by height of 300 pixels. And now we have an image that we can use. So that image can now be used to display whatever we want. And then we'll have some text here. And we'll make this text font size, let's say large. And we'll make the font weight bold. So it's a bold product description. And then we'll align this on the right. So we'll do text align equal to right. And here we'll just have $sign and then product.price. So now we have like the basics of what we want this to look like. So we have the price, we have the name, we have the image. We're not using all of this yet, but let's see what this looks like when we launch the code on the web. So here we are. She's not overly pretty, but we do have the name, we have an image, and we have the price. So we do have the beginnings of our page. So what I'm going to do now is we're going to add the button that handles when someone wants to actually purchase the product. So we can work on that. And then we'll work on adding in up here a cart pricing. So someone can click on it and they'll also be able to see what's in their cart as well as keeping track of their price. So let's minimize this and get back into the code. So we're back in the code and we have this simple grid that has all of our details here in this VStack, but we need to add a button. So we can do that by doing a center. And a center essentially sentences it into the parent, and then we can do a button. And then I'm going to add a color scheme here equal to purple. And we'll do a size equal to large. We'll do a width of 100%. We'll do a class name, and this is the important part. Class name is equal to Snipcart dash add item. So that now knows that you can add an item with it. And then if you remember back originally, the way that this works is essentially we tell it the data for each part. So the ID, the price, the URL, description, image, and name, so that it knows what to reference when you click the button. So we can do that by doing data item and then the ID. And then let's close this button out so that we have the button, say add to cart. And then let's start filling in these props. So we have ID, we have price, we have URL, we have description, and we have image. And finally, we have the name. So all of those are required from Snipcart to know exactly what each product is. So we can do product.id, and we can just copy this down for now, and we can change the prop. So this will be price. This will be something different, so we'll change that in a minute. We'll do this one as description. We'll do this as image, and we'll do this as name. Now, the way we're going to do this URL is we're going to do, and this depends on all sorts of factors, but I've decided that I'm going to do /products/ and then $product URL. And this is a way to say, hey, this is where you can find the actual product. Now you'll notice that this doesn't actually exist right now. We don't have that in our pages, and we're going to create this in a minute. We're going to create a way to essentially have a dynamic set that we can use, and all it's going to do is do the exact same functionality as this, except from we're going to add in the description and maybe change a few things around to make it look a bit different. But for now, this will be fine. So if we hit save now and we go back into the application, we should see the button, and the button should function. Okay, so here we are back in the code. We now have this big purple button to add to cart. When we click it, we now see a cart summary with pizza, and we can technically check out at this point, and we could go through the whole process. But let's continue shopping. Let's see what happens when we add 2. We can change the quantity, 3, $75, and we're good to go. Problem is we don't know how to track that number. We can't track this information. So let's work on adding in a way to keep tabs on the price. So inside of here, we're going to add something called cart. So you can do cart. And we're going to set that to an empty object. And we're going to use Snipcart. And then we can say const subtotal equals 0 equals cart. So this will be 0 in the beginning, but we can also keep it updated. So now we have this. What we can do essentially is use it anywhere that we want. But I think it would be cool to put this in the nav content. So when someone's looking at the navigation on our desktop, we can keep it there, but we could also use it on this page if we wanted to. So let's cut this out and let's move it somewhere else. So inside of this components folder, you'll find there's something called layout. And inside of this, under nav content, we have this essentially set of links here. This one goes to the admin screen, this one goes to the home page, and these two are just blank. If you scroll down, you'll see that there's this desktop nav content and it takes in properties. So if we paste these two pieces in and then we import them here, so we take this use Snipcart and import that into our top section. So this will allow us to use it on the page. So what we can do now is use this subtotal to tell the user how much they've spent. So what we can do here is underneath this H stack, we can do a button here. We'll just do a basic button and we'll give it a class name. So class name is equal to Snipcart checkout. And then this button can be a span. And inside of this span, we can do $ subtotal dot toFixed 2. And we can close this out. And this should now give us access to the subtotal. So if we go back to our application, we should be able to see this now on screen and start playing around with it. So we've come back to the app and now you can see we have this $75, which was 3 pizzas. If you click this, it now opens this cart summary so someone can check out. And if we add something and close this, it's now $100. So now we have access to all of that. So now we're kind of building this site. We really need to work on a way to add in a page to handle the products dynamically. So if we add a new product, Snipcart will know where they are, and 2, someone can see them, and 2, a way to add these to our application. So we're back in the code and we now need to build out this products page that allows us to use this. Now, the reason we're building this is twofold. One, we want to be able to click on a product and see a bigger description and more things like that. But also, the way that Snipcart works, you have 2 ways to basically validate that a product is real and someone is trying not to essentially hijack your code to do something. Option number 1 is you use an API to verify it, or you can use the URLs. So we're going to build out all these dynamic URLs so that they can verify that the URL actually exists. So what we can do here is go to Pages and create a new folder and call the folder Products. And then inside of that, we're going to create a set of square brackets like that. And we're going to do ID because we're passing in a single ID that is expected as part of our URL. So now we have the ID. What we can do is start creating how this works. So the good thing is that we're actually going to use a lot of code from here to produce what we want. So we can copy these 3 here and put them at the top, and also take next link, and we'll use that as well. And we'll just make sure that this has an extra ... in here. And then we can create the component here, export default function, product, and we're going to be passing in data here. So we can just do data, and then we can return something in here. We also need export async function getStaticProps. And the getStaticProps is coming with a parameter this time. And then finally, we need async function getStaticPaths. And the way that this works is getStaticPaths is actually going to return the parameter for each of our pages. So for each product we have, getStaticPaths knows about it, and getStaticProps can use that to retrieve the data. So this essentially works as a way of mapping through all of our pages. Now let's talk about this ID. So the ID is going to be passed into this parameter. Now, if you remember, we have this getProductsBy ID that takes in the ID, which is why it's also named ID, and that's what we're going to be passing in. So let's work on getStaticPaths first. The good news is that getStaticPaths is actually the same query as this, but slightly shorter. So we can take this, copy it, and drop it in here. And then we don't want all of this. We only need the ID. That's the only part we need returned. So now we have this query that we can use to create our paths. So we can create a const here called paths and set that to data, all products, dot data. So that's data, all products, and then the data. And now we have access to the ID. So we can do dot map because we're going to be returning every single one. We can do products, and then we can open a set of parentheses, then open a set of braces and say params ID product dot ID. And then we must make sure that we have enough here to close everything out. And then we can return. So say return paths. And then we need to tell it if we're going to use fallback. And in this example, we're going to set it to true. And the reason is that imagine if you just added a new product and someone clicks on it immediately. This page won't actually be built yet because it could still be processing. So this allows us to use a server-side request to actually get all of the data from getStaticProps. So we'll hit save here, and now we'll work on getStaticProps. So getStaticProps is going to essentially use the same style of query. Like we're still going to return data, name, URL, image, description, price, and ID, except from the query is going to be slightly different. So first, let's take in the ID, which comes from this params. So we can do params, and that comes from down here. So that's how it's all matched up. And we can do a const res await client.query. And then inside of here is where we're going to wait for our response and do something with a query. The query is going to be the same as before. So what we can do here is essentially take this query here and then just make it slightly different. So we can do query and put it in here and say query, GraphQL query. Instead of get all products, we're going to do get products $, ID, string, and then get products by ID. So we're going to get products by ID, and we're going to pass in the same ID. So we can do ID and then string, and then we're going to return the same data. And the last thing we need to do is tell it how to get these variables. So we can do variables down here and say ID equals ID. And then we can just return what we need. So we can do const data is equal to res data dot get products by ID. So that's get products by ID, and we want the data out of that. And that's what's going to be returned up here. Then all we need to do is do basically the same thing that we did here. We can essentially return all of this data here in here. So we can just do a return. And inside of our return statement, we can do a box. And then inside of that box, we can return all of this data. And then we can just make some changes. So instead of having a product name as an H4, let's make that an H1. Then we can remove this part, make the text aligned. We can leave the image, but let's make it bigger. So 900 pixels by 450. We can also leave this product price, but underneath it, we can do text and then close the text out and say, we would like the product.description and hit save. So at this point, we now have this functioning page. And what we can do with this is take this, and in fact, we don't actually need next link for this. We can hit save, and now someone can read a bigger description, see a bigger image, and then add it to the cart. So let's go and look at this page, make sure it functions correctly, and then we can start talking about the admin screens. So before we go and check to make sure this works, let's just make sure everything is good here. We've got a query that has an ID and a string. We have this data. Oh, we need to return the data. So let's do return. And then props, and then data, and hit save. Okay, now we're returning everything, and we're taking that in. Now everything should be good to go, so let's check to see what that looks like. And here we are. We now have a product that has a description. Pizza is better than hot dogs. We can click add to cart. It adds it to our cart. We can go back to the products page via this link, and we can see our products if we had hundreds. So that part's all good. What we need to do is handle authentication. I've already built out all the authentication components for us. So all we need to do is create the functionality behind that. So we already have pages, login and register, but we need to fill in the details. Once we fill in the details of how we expect this to work, then we'll be able to add the admin screen, which the admin screen allows us to essentially check to make sure that the person has logged in, and then they can add a product. And if they happen to add a product correctly, it will get added to the screen here. Otherwise, it won't work as expected. So let's go ahead and start working on authentication. So we're back in the code here, and I've created these two login pages. We have login and register. And let's talk about what they look like first. So if I minimize the screen, here is the login screen. And here is the register screen. Looks fairly similar, except from you get to pick a role based upon what you want when you create an account. And then I just have these two options here to kind of flip back and forth between the two pages. So I didn't want to build these on this video. It's just a basic form, and I didn't want to waste a lot of time showing you how to build registration and login forms. So I've taken care of that, but the important part is how the login and register actually works behind the scenes using our Fauna functions that we created. So let's minimize this screen and go back to the code. So we're back in the code, and let's talk about this login and then the register screens. So the register screen first just has this set of on-change handlers that update these states: email, password, and role. Then we have this request options that is a post method that is going to stringify the email, password, and role that is selected by the user. So the only part we really have to do is fill in this gap, but we need to create APIs to handle this securely. So let's talk about how that's going to work. So we're going to create an API here. We can go ahead and delete this hello. And we can add in a new one, and we're going to call it login. So we're actually going to create folders for each one. So we're going to do register. And this is just to keep your code neat. And then we're going to create a new file. I'm going to call it index.js. And then inside the index.js, we're going to use the same client and library stuff that we've used before. So we can drop these in here, client and GraphQL. And then we're going to do a module exports equals async request response. And then inside of here is where we're actually going to do the work. So when you register, what we're expecting here is email, password, and role. So we can get those by doing const email, password, role equal to request body data. And that matches here. So this is the data, and this is coming from the request and going in the body. So that's how we're going to get that data. Then we need to actually do something with our data. So we can do await client.mutate. So we're using the mutation here instead of a query. And we're going to use the create user. So if you remember back to your schema here, we have this create user that calls this function and does something. So we can use that in here. So we can do create user. But first we need to name it. So let's do mutate and then mutation. To tell it that we're going to use a mutation here, we need GraphQL, and then we can do our query. So the query is going to be mutation register user, and then we're going to use our create user function here. So create user, and then we're going to give it a data. And then inside of that data, we're going to just quickly fix that. It should be parentheses, not a set of braces. And we should do data, and we're going to do email, password, role. And we can do something we need to do here is wrap these in a set of quotes and then pass in the email and the password and the role. So we're going to do email and password need to be in these sort of strings here. And then the role will just be $role. Like so. And the reason we're doing this is ats and stuff like that need to be escaped. So if you put them in a string like this, it won't get broken when we try and return the data. So now we have the create user. We need to return something as part of this function. So we'll just return the email address. And then all we need to do is handle if it was successful or not. So we can do an if data create user. So we're basically saying if this happens, do res status 200.json, and we'll just do something simple for now. We'll just do success and say okay, and then we'll set an error to null like so, and we'll just put these in double quotes. And then we can say else. We can copy this down here. Say 500. And then status. Success no. Error. Error. Registering. New user. Now this is obviously not production ready. So there's going to be error handling that you should be doing. But for us, this will suffice as a good example, and we can hit save. And now we have this register API. So as we're already working in APIs, we might as well do the login because it's fairly similar in nature. So if we create another folder here and call it login, and make sure we put it in the right folder, and then create another index.js, we can actually copy this whole function here from register, and we can just change what we actually want. So we're not going to expect a role. We only need email and password. And instead of that, we can have user login, and then we can have login user, and we're only expecting this. And what we're actually going to return is nothing. So we don't actually need this part for this mutation. So what we're saying here is, hey, go ahead and log in. Here's the data, email, and password. And then we can say if the login, so instead of create user, if login user, here's something. Otherwise, error. And we can just say user data and set this to null. And then error, error, logging in. Okay. What's terrible right now, though, is if this works, we're not actually doing anything with the login. We're just saying, hey, it worked. Great. Like, carry on. But we don't actually know if they're logged in. Has it been a specific amount of time? Should they be able to still do things like that? So we can create something inside our lib folder called auth cookie.js, and we can use a cookie, which is an npm package, to essentially give us a cookie that we can retrieve and use for our admin screens. So let's talk about how this is going to work, and then we'll add it, and then we'll start to see this project come to a close. So the first thing you need to do is add cookie. So you can do yarn add cookie, and that will add the cookie package. And while that's happening, we're going to import two things from cookie, serialize and pass. And that's going to be from cookie. So this auth cookie is probably not what you want to do in production. There's probably more you need to do, but for us, we're just going to use a token and then use that to store a cookie. And just keep that in mind if you're going to start doing this in production, that this may need more work. So we're going to give a token name, and that const token name is, we're going to call it Fauna token. Then we need to give it a max age, and this is going to be 60 by 60 by 8, which is 8 hours. And then we can say export function set auth cookie. And we're going to take in the response and the token. And then we're also going to have export function remove auth cookie. So this would handle if we had a login screen. We don't have one, but I'm adding this code so that you can have it. And then we also need get auth cookie. So export function get auth cookie. And this will allow us to essentially get from a request and return the cookie. So the cookie is quite simple. We're going to create a const called cookie. We're going to serialize, so serialize the token name, which is Fauna token, and then comma token, which gets passed in. Then on top of that, we just need to set a few things. We're going to say this is an HTTP only and set that to true. We're going to set the max age to our max age constant. We're going to set the path to /. We're going to say same site is set to lax. And then secure. And then we're going to just say process.env.node m equals production. We just want to say, yeah, like this is production. Then we want it to be a secure one. So now we have that cookie. We can just respond back. So res set header and set it to set cookie, comma, cookie. And now we have the secure cookie where we can use it wherever we need to once a user is logged in. So we can hit save here. Then for removing it, we can just say const cookie equals serialize. We'll just copy this down, paste it here. Actually, we can just take this section here and paste it here for us and say, instead of the token itself, we're just going to set it to an empty string. And then all we need to do is say inside of this part, max age equals -1. And path is set to /. So if we have a logout, we can also do that. And then we can use the same set header to pass it here. Now we just need to do our get auth. So we're going to say if rec cookies, then return rec cookies, and then the name. And this is if, essentially, if we're on an API level, we don't actually need to request the cookies or pass them. Otherwise, const cookies equals pass request header dot cookie or empty string return cookies token name. So essentially what we're saying here is if there isn't any cookies, just return, it will be an empty string. And then we can return the cookie's name. So if we hit save here, this cookie is now ready to be used. So what we can do in the login API is go back to that. And instead of just setting this, we can say set auth cookie to res, so the response, plus data.login user. And then we can just import this at the top. So it's going to be in the same lib as this Apollo client. So we just copy this down and say set auth cookie, and then all these slashes, and instead it will be auth-cookie. So now we have our login APIs that we can use on our login pages here. So if we go back to the register page, we just need to do our onSubmit part here. And we can handle our onSubmit fairly easily by just using this data here, which is what we're expecting our post to be with our email, password, and role. We can use that in here. So we can do await fetch /API, so /API /register. And we can just do a comma here and say request options. So we're just saying, hey, take these request options inside of here. Then, and this is where we would handle whatever we needed. In our example, we're going to assume that there is just a happy path. So we're going to do .then registered, and then an arrow function and say set email to blank, comma, set password also to blank, set loading to false, so comma, set loading equal to false, and then we can just do a quick check here. So we can do if, and let's just put this on another line to make it easier to read. We can say if registered, so if this registered equal dot success equals okay. We can then router.push, because we have this option here, router.push, and we can just send them to the login screen. And that will allow us to essentially say, hey, yeah, you're registered, just go ahead and log in now. And then the user can just straight log in. And then the only other part we need to do is say, okay, then. So when the then is done, we can do .catch. And just for now, we can do catch e, and then e dot console.log e. And that's our registration done. So now we have ability to register our accounts. Let's just format this so it makes it a bit easier for our eyes. So we're saying await fetch the API that we just created. Then, if they're registered, set the email, password, and loading to empty strings and false. If the register is successful, go ahead and push us to login. Otherwise, just catch the error. Now, in this example, if you did the opposite of this, so if it did this, else, we could put up a toast and say error registering account, or you could handle the error however you needed to. So let's move on to the login screen. So now we have this login, which is essentially the same idea. What we're going to do is do the exact same thing as we just did with the other one. So we can actually copy and paste code, as all good developers should. Copy this, drop it here, and say, okay, instead of register, let's do login. And then just set this to then user. And then we can say, set this password and email and set loading to false. And then if user underscore data is not equal to null, route a push, and we'll just send them back to the homepage for now. Otherwise, we can catch it. And that's it. So now we have all of this login done. Let's test to make sure that our logins work. Okay, so here we are at the login screen, and we have our old login. So jameshay.com, click continue, and we get the correct screen. We'll say not now. And let's see if we can find our cookie. Okay, so here we are in our cookies. Under localhost, we have this Fauna, and here is our secured token that we can use to make requests as our user in the future. So that's all working. So login's working, which means our registration is also working. So what we can do now is start working on our admin screen. And our admin screen is going to do two things. One, it's going to allow a user to add a product and delete the product. And then finally, we want to use APIs to do all of that and start making sure that we can actually restrict based upon if it's a manager or not. So here we are in our admin screen. What I have done for us is build out essentially most of the UI. The UI has two tabs here, and one contains how to add a product, which is basically each of those: product name, description, image, price, slug, and product ID. Then we also have a second one, which is a way to delete a product. So how do we delete the product? How do we add a product? And also, how do we get the data that we know are already products and how are they available? Like, we need to do something in here to be able to show the user the products. On top of that, I have a couple of on-handle change events. So this one handles all of the handling in the form. So each one of those will update our state here. And then I have a second one for the product delete, which just takes the target value because it's only ever going to be one. So we have those two. So the things we need to build out is how do we get all the data from our APIs? And two, what do we do about making requests to this add product? So let's start with the essentials. First of all, let's talk about an admin screen. One key element of an admin screen is we want it to be secure. So if someone's not logged in, we don't want them to be able to grab a new product or, delete a product or add a product that costs $0. We don't want any of that to happen. So what we can do is do const token, and this is why we have that get auth token. So we do get auth token context request. So inside our request headers will be our auth token. So I've just imported that here at the top, and we're going to use that to essentially make this work. So it's get auth cookie, not get auth token, and that will grab our cookie if someone is logged in. So we can essentially say if there is no token for whatever reason, we can do context.res.writeHead, set it to a 303 and say location, login, and then context, res end. So essentially what we're saying here is, hey, just temporarily redirect them back to the login screen. This is not a full redirect. It's only a temporary one. Otherwise, we can then do our server-side props stuff. So we're using get server-side props this time versus get any other kind of props. We're not using get static props. We're using get server-side. What we're actually going to do is do the same query that we did here. We want to just get all of the products because we want to be able to use them for certain pieces. So what we actually need is the ID for this product. So we need to be able to pass that along and say, hey, here is the product ID. Is this what you want to delete? So we can just take this query here and say, I would like this part to be passed into our admin screen. So if they aren't being redirected, they're going to get this screen where they can essentially get all products. And what we can do is just reduce this down to just the ID. Then we can return the props just the way we did before. So return props, and then all products. So now we're returning all the product data, just the ID, but we are returning all the product data. So based upon that, we're getting all products here, and we're just pulling those into data. And when you see that we're not using this data anywhere at this time, so now we can use it here in our select to basically show someone the ID that they might be deleting. So we can just do data.map product. So we're going to map over the product. And then inside of here, we're going to do return option, which is a select option for a drop-down menu, key equal to product.id. Value will also be product.id. And then the name that people see will also be product.id. Now you could change this. You could use the product name if you so wish. I just think it's cleaner if we use the IDs. And then we can close this out and make sure that we've closed everything else out. So we have a close here, but we also need a parentheses there, and hit save. Okay, so now that's done. We now have a way to essentially have somebody delete a product if they so wish. We also have the ability to do an add product too. So we have everything, at least in the UI, done. We don't have a way in here to delete a product or add the product. So let's just talk about this for a second. Let's just think this through. So the added delete product are going to work the same way as they have before. We're just going to make an API call, so we can just do something like await fetch. And then we'll create an API route called delete product. And we'll just do a comma here and do request options. And then a dot then. And say, we're not even going to check. We'll just do router.reload. And that will delete the product and then re-engage this query. And then we can do a dot catch that says, here's an error. That's all well and good. But what we want to do is also in our API, make sure that they are the right kind of role. Do they have a token? Can we use that token? Because right now, every query that we run is actually being run as the server, which is perfectly fine for everything except from these two queries. These queries, we want to actually use the user's token, which is what's inside of this getAuth token. When we get this token, that's what's inside, is their bearer token that they can use. So what we're going to do is we're going to make these two await fetches here, and we're going to make them exactly the same just to make things easier. So we can just do that underneath here, and we'll say this one is add product. And then we are good to go in this section, but let's start making these APIs. So let's do a folder here and call it add product. Make another API file called delete product. And we'll start with the add product. So we can do index.js, open that up, and let's talk about how this is going to work. So what we're going to do is we're actually going to use Apollo client. We're going to then, instead of initializing it originally like we did here, if we go back to our lib folder and look at this, we're actually using this headers here, but we don't need to do that. So we can actually take this code here and drop that in here for now. But we're going to change this from the Fauna DB secret to the one that the user is actually using, and we can grab that from using our handy dandy library that we created from the Auth token. So we can import that at the top too. The getAuth cookie, we can use that token. And then what else we need to do is also do the GraphQL. So we can import it here by doing comma, GraphQL, comma. And now we have everything we need to essentially run this API call. So what we can do is take this module exports, which is just the beginning of every single serverless function. We can wrap the whole thing in it like this. So now we have the beginnings of something. What we're going to do, instead of doing an export, is just do const client. But first we need to get the stuff that we're going to be adding. So part of our admin screen here is all of these different types: name, URL, description, image, and price. We can add those here. So we can do const image, name, URL, price, and we can just take out all of the JSON object, and we can just put in commas here. And then we can wrap this in a set of parentheses and say equals reg body product. And that's coming, obviously, let's just talk about this one more time. It may not be obvious to everybody here. So we've got this product here that we're using a state for, and we're going to be passing that down here. So we're stringifying that, and we can grab the data based upon our request body, name, URL, image, description, price, and ID. And then we can use that wherever we need to. Most importantly, we need to get the token. And we say get auth cookie request. So we know that they're going to have a token at this point, and we can then use this token here. So instead of using this, we can say, please use this token as the authorization. So now we're essentially saying to them, okay, go ahead. Let's just format this real quick. Go ahead, grab all of this data from the product body, then get the token from auth token, then verify by making a client here using their token. So if they're logged in as a manager at this point, now we're using their token versus the server token or an employee token or vice versa. So this means that it's either going to successfully pass because they're allowed to do it, otherwise it's going to fail. So now we're protecting our inserts by being part of these roles through authorization. So what we need to do now is do our mutation again. So we're going to do a const here. I'm going to say data is equal to await client mutate. And then inside of our mutation, we're going to do a mutation, GraphQL. And then inside of our GraphQL, we're going to do mutation, add product. Now, if you remember when we wrote this, you can copy and paste this if you want from our original work that we did when we created all of our things. So that's what I'm going to do here. I'm going to take the mutation and I'm going to copy and paste it. So instead of writing this all out, I have it on screen and we can just paste it in and talk about it. So we're going to be adding a product from the ID, and then we're going to take in the data, which is all coming from here. And then we're going to return the name. Then what we're going to do now that we have this handy dandy mutation that's just happened, we can then do if data dot add product. So essentially saying if something gets returned, so if this gets returned, we know it's successful. So we can do res.status200.json, and we can just say name. And this is for our own error handling. So we can say, okay, go ahead and get that name from here. And then we can do name, comma, error, null. And this would allow you to handle the error if you so wished. Else, we can just do a copy and paste and set this to 500, name to null, and error to error adding product. And then we can format this one more time and hit save. And now we have this add product API that we can use. So essentially all we're doing is getting the token that the user is logged in with, adding that as a bearer token, and then going ahead and adding in the product via a mutation that we created in our functions here. Add product. Then if it is successful, we're just going to return the product. Otherwise, we're just going to send a 500 down, and we could do something with that, pop up a toast message, do whatever you want with the UI at that point. So now we have that. We should do one for delete product. The delete product is going to work the same way from at least the beginning parts here. So we can just go ahead and paste this in and make sure that we close everything out. We're not going to be getting this part from the body, but we're still going to be using this Apollo client. So what we're going to do for a delete product is we're just going to get the ID. So we can just go ahead and delete all of this and say, get the ID from data. And you can see that in our admin screen here under delete product, API delete product, and we're sending down a stringified data, which just has the ID. So we're going to take that and we're going to say, okay, we've got that. What do we need to do with it? Well, we need to mutate that by sending down a delete request. So we can just do const data is equal to await client dot mutate. And then inside of here is where we do our mutation. Similarly, we have this GraphQL that we saved when we were creating all of our things and testing them. So we can just copy them and paste them in. So here is the mutation. Mutation delete product by ID, and then return the name. And that's the same as the schema delete product. So now we have that. What do we need to do now? Well, we need to say, hey, what happens if we do delete it? What happens if we don't? So we can just format this one more time so it's a bit neater and say, if data dot delete product. So if something comes back from this delete product, res status 200 dot JSON name, and then we'll just do data.delete product.name, comma, error, null, and then else. We can just take this and say, okay, it was actually a 500. There is no name. And there was an error, deleting product, errored, and hit save. Okay, so now we have everything. We can add, delete our products. We can log in. We can register. We can look at our products. Let's test to make sure that this add and delete works. And then once we've done that, we can deploy this via Vercel, which is as simple as deploying it to Vercel and adding in your 2 keys that are in your env.local. And then we can show you the power of Snipcart. So here we are in our update store admin screen. We have all of these things that we can add and then this delete. So if we click this button, we should be able to delete the product out and then it should reload and work. And then if we add a product, we can do that too. So let's add a product first. Let's say hot dogs. Hot dogs are better than pizza. Let's just skip the product URL and I'll paste one in. And then we'll do hot dog. And then let's put a product image in here. So let me just grab one. Okay, so I've successfully deployed the product and we have this domain. What we need to do is go into your dashboard in Snipcart and make sure that you have the domain set. So I have it here, Fauna ecom Vercel.app, and then hit save. And now what we can do is actually test this. So now it's deployed. We can go here and say, all right, I really want some awesome sauce. So I've added that to my cart and I've also added the awesome sauce too. Let's go to checkout and let's say Steve Jones. And then I'll put my email and we'll say 50 30 West Village, Virginia. Continue to payment. Now this is all in test Stripe, but the idea is the same. So all the 4 2s, 12, 32, 1, 2, 3, hit place order. Now what's happening right this very second, before this invoice came up, which is now successfully done, and we've charged $40 to our Stripe account, what's happening is it's going to make sure that this awesome source and awesome source 2 IDs of products actually match. So what it's doing is going to this product slash awesome source and making sure that it actually exists on our platform. If it doesn't exist, what happens is you get an error message. So let's test what happens if we delete it. So let's add hot dogs to our thing here. Go to the admin screen, go to delete product, and go to hot dogs, click delete. That product no longer exists. So in a second, this will get refreshed. There we go. But it's still in our cart. So if I go to checkout now, and we put in, that might be too many. There we go. Continue to payment, and do 424242s. And hit place order. Could not be processed. URL of some products could not be reached. Review domain settings and product URLs. This entry on validation obviously is only in the developer and in the test mode, but this basically shows you that, like, because hot dogs don't exist, we can't actually process your request. So if we delete this out and then close and go to our screen again, go to checkout, do 424242s, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, place order. Then apparently our awesome source does no longer exist either, which is true. As you can see, it no longer exists. If we add it back, delete this out, click checkout, do 424242s. And boom, we can start ordering again. So that's how it protects you from people trying to spoof anything. So that's the end of the crash course. You've learned how to set up Fauna for authentication, authorization. You've learned how to use Snipcart. You've learned how Snipcart works behind the scenes to protect you. You've learned how to add products, remove products, everything that you need for a simple e-commerce store. So if you did enjoy this video, make sure to drop it a like. Comment on things you want to see. I hope you enjoyed all the GraphQL and everything else that came along with it. And until next time, see ya.